Getting back to the pressure that guys put on themselves and women put on themselves to perform, Harley Race was a huge influence in you, and he just passed away a couple of weeks ago, unfortunately. Talk about his influence, because there are times that you would talk about what would Harley do as kind of being your mindset at times, and he's the guy who was one of the most important wrestlers of his time period, one of the last traveling NWA World Heavyweight Champions, and a legitimate tough guy who beat up Vince McMahon allegedly and pulled a gun on Hulk Hogan allegedly, and all these other crazy stories you hear about him, which I heard the Vince story was true this week. Les Thatcher told me that, so someone blame him if it's not.
Well, it must be true then.
Yeah.
I read it on the internet, so.
That's it. Well, on certain sites. But talk a little bit about Harley. Talk a little bit about Harley and his influence on you and what it was like learning under him.
I mean, I wish the guy was still around. And this might sound really, really cruel, but the last couple of years weren't kind to Harley. So it's just like, now that he's passed on, I feel like it's more of a relief. He wasn't surrounded with like a whole bunch of, he's watched everybody go, And then I know the last time I spent a little bit of time with him is, he was in and out, and he didn't know who I was, 1 second, and then the next second he would. So, that's life, right? Harley was kind of a guy that I never thought I would ever wrestle, or not that I wrestled him. He did take a bump for me, though, so that's pretty cool. But I never thought I would work for him or anything. And my buddy Ace moved back to Kansas City, and he started working for Harley, and he wound up buying Harley's gym, running Harley's gym. And Harley would bring me in anytime he could. And I want to say, like, one of the first times I got to quote unquote work with him is when he was brought in to do was it Mid-America Wrestling, like a title tournament, and he refereed the finals, and I was in that match, and I just remember him being like, all that 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2 shit, don't do that. And I said, yes, sir. Because he couldn't get up and down to count to 3, you know what I mean? And it taught me a valuable lesson. It was just like anytime the Crusher would cover somebody, that was a finish, because nobody kicked out on the Crusher. And it was like one of those light bulbs that he helped set off over my head that he didn't inadvertently explain to me, but it was like one of those things that, like, oh, I get it now. Every time I was on the mat, like somebody, headlock takeover, he'd come over to check on me, make sure my shoulders weren't down, and he'd stick his fingers up my nose. And his nose were just like, his fingers were like gigantic. So it hurt. It wasn't like, oh, he's got his fingers. No, it was just like, oh. And they smelled like nicotine, like cigarettes. Like, it was brutal. And that was the same night. I can't remember if he took a bump for me that night or if it was a different time, but that was the famous story of spent all night in the bar with him, and then I had to give him a lift in my brand new car back to the hotel, and he threw up all over my car. That's a good one. There's a whole new generation of people who probably don't know that story, but
it's quite the badge of honor.
It's very strange. I remember at the end of the night, like he barfs in my car, and he's like hardcore about it because he's like throwing up in his mouth, and then he's spitting it out the window as we're driving, and I start to like pull over, and he famously says, as he chokes down vomit that's in his mouth, "Don't pull over. It'll alert the authorities." I was like, all right. So I keep driving, get to the hotel, we get out, my car's covered in puke. He's covered in puke. And me and Ace walk him to the elevator. And Harley turns around and he goes, "Well, my friend, can you ever forgive me for throwing up in your car?" And I said, "Yeah, Harley, don't worry about it." And then he went in and hugged me. He had puke all over his chest, and I was just like, Yeah, and me and Ace drove home. We were up in Wisconsin. We drove home the whole way, just like fucking dying laughing that this happened. I got a ton of Harley stories. I got the one about the Ultimate Warrior, which I can't say. And if you've seen Dave Chappelle's new stand-up,
Sticks and Stones,
you know why I can't tell that story. And Harley used to walk around with a taser.
Fun
Not
guy.
one that you could like shoot and the prongs would go into somebody. He'd walk around with like one of those old school ones that just like made that horrible noise. And he would shock people all the time. I remember I was always reading stories. He would always do it to Owen. He did it to everybody. Thankfully, he never shocked me, but he would always stand next to me and press the button, and it would scare the living shit out of me. So I was always in fear anytime I was around him. He had that taser in his hand that he was going to jam the thing into my leg, and I'd probably pee myself.